Greetings and hello to all of you as we conclude today our look at the first 100 days of the Joe Biden presidential administration. Currently, we are somewhere close to the 70-day mark following President Biden's inauguration on January the 20th. The end of April, the 30th or so, will bring this very symbolic, but nonetheless important, as it relates to modern American presidents. This 100-day period will come to an end. We know, of course, that by this time we've seen a lot of improvement, if that's the right word, on the COVID front and on multiple aspects of the COVID front. By this time, hopefully, anyone who was at an at-risk group, those over the age of 65, those with underlying health conditions, and then lots of first responders and teachers and doctors and those who deal with the public daily on a regular basis, have had an opportunity, if they've chosen to take it, to receive a vaccination in their state. We're now at a point approaching 3 million vaccinations being administered per day, meaning that soon, if we trust the science and the epidemiologists, something that I truly do, we are going to start to reach this herd immunity level, which is going to mean that the virus is going to have fewer and fewer targets to spread to. We've seen that the $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package, the COVID relief package, has of course been passed, signed into law by President Biden, all Democrats voting in both houses for it, no Republicans in either house voting for it, all voting against it. But nonetheless, we've already seen that stimulus checks and continued unemployment supplements are now making their way to the pockets of Americans and the unemployed. Recently, we've seen some very encouraging news on the job front. Every week, the number of unemployment claims, while still high, and in many cases, pre-COVID would be record highs, are declining. And we received a very optimistic jobs report from the Labor Department showing that unemployment in March had again ticked down to numbers that are soon going to be within what has considered to be an acceptable range for unemployment in the United States. Stock market doing well. And again, the general mood, the optimism seems to be palpable. You can sense that there is a more optimistic America. And I've already read in several of the periodicals that I read regularly that this might usher in another decade of the roaring 20s in the United States. Not unlike the 1920s, the decade that followed again the end of World War I, the taming of the great Spanish flu, the last significant pandemic the world faced, the economic downturn that was associated with the war ending and the Spanish flu proliferating. When these phenomena were under control, we would suddenly see again a great period of boom for the early and mid-1920s. There are many economists who believe that if we're fortunate, we might be on the cusp of another decade of the Roaring Twenties, in this case, of course, the 2020s. So we're going to bring this look at President Biden's first 100 days to an end by taking a look for a while at the cabinet and the close advisors that are going to, at least in the short term, be very important players as President Biden, like every American president, begins to roll out his agenda, begins to lay out positions on various areas of policy, from jobs to race relations to education, and eventually, of course, to matters of foreign policy. Who presidents select to serve in their cabinets often give us an idea as to whether or not policy in their various areas of specialization is going to be consistent with previous administrations or the previous Trump administration, or are we going to see differences, deviations, 180s from policies that we've seen pursued in the last 4 years? Typically, when a new president comes into office who happens to be from the party other than his predecessor, in modern times that has usually augured some significant changes in policy that might be afoot. So today we're going to look at the, and no pun intended, the infrastructure of the executive branch and how, sitting at the top of the executive branch, the president has at his disposal hundreds of positions to whom he could nominate individuals to occupy political appointments, and several different areas of the executive branch through which he can both obtain information, insight, advice, and in the other direction, through these parts of the executive branch, presidents are able sometimes very quickly to begin to lay out and effectuate their own policies. Now, as we noted in our last lecture, the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt, and then certainly Franklin Roosevelt, and then 20 years or so later, that of Lyndon Johnson, would play a role in greatly transforming and expanding the role of the federal government, the national government, in many areas of American life and of American policy that previously had thought to have been within the province of the individual states and their legislatures. The word we might use is the federalizing of a lot of areas of policy would in fact be the result of the very assertive, aggressive actions of presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and then in the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson. The result is to leave us today with a very large cabinet, a very large collection of federal departments that, again, are under the control of the president, who sits atop the executive branch, and the president, of course, with the advice and consent of the Senate, is the person who appoints individuals to run these various cabinet-level departments. Beginning at the turn of the last century, in the presidencies, again, of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and then others that followed him, we would see Congress begin the process of expanding the number of cabinet departments that existed. And through the 20th century, we would see new additional cabinet departments created. but we would also see the building out of what political scientists today call the administrative state. The idea that in areas of policy that Congress has chosen to assert a federal jurisdiction, where Congress has looked at the Constitution, typically Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and more specifically, the provision in Article 1, Section 8 that gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, Congress has used this as a means to, again, federalize, to exert some federal control over expanding areas of American life. And as Congress has ventured into the mechanics, for instance, of the federal income tax, or as Congress in 1933 created Social Security, and then later Medicare, as Congress has chosen to be a source for the funding of the construction of bridges and highways and dams and other construction projects, we've recognized that Congress is a body that consists of just 535 members. Many of them these days, getting a little long of tooth, getting a little up in age. And it happens to be a fact of modern American government that Congress takes a lot of time off. We are now in the middle of Congress taking a 3-week Easter recess. They're back home doing constituent service, or at least that's what they tell us. So Congress cannot, in and of itself, actually deal with the implementation and the enforcement of the laws they've made, reaching in again to these varying, diverse areas of policy. So the answer has been for Congress to create, within the executive branch, an agency. And we know all of the alphabet agencies that have evolved in the last 100 years. Some of the early ones, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, the Federal Reserve. And then later, of course, as we became the beneficiaries of great bursts of inventiveness and new ways to travel and new ways to acquire information. The FCC, the FAA, the National Transportation Safety Board, the list goes on and on and on. There are approximately 100 of these congressional creations, these agencies that are placed within the executive branch and thus directly under the control on a day-to-day basis of the president. These federal agencies are really interesting creations of Congress because of the great amount of power that Congress, through the legislative process, has chosen to give to these agencies. For instance, if Congress were to, in the next several months, once again change the tax code, raising taxes on corporations, reducing taxes on some, it would then be the job of the Treasury Department, but more specifically the IRS, to take that broad piece of tax legislation and actually write the rules and regulations that would permit the IRS to implement these changes in our tax code. So the job of implementing the desires of Congress, in communications, in aviation, in the relationship between workers and their employers, The National Labor Relations Board, I think, is going to be in the news a lot during the Biden administration. Those powers to implement legislation was given by Congress to these agencies, who often also give to these agencies the ability to actually write more specific rules to give the public or those affected by these laws a better understanding of how they might comply with those laws. Rulemaking at the agency level is described today as a quasi-legislative action, almost or sort of a legislative function. Yes, Congress is the legislative branch. That's where big bills that might become law are made and sent on to the president. But we find increasingly that Congress has also, in their legislation, delegated to now one of these existing federal agencies the power to make more specific rules as to how these laws are going to be introduced and complied with. Many critics of the administrative state, of the expanded role of executive power, have argued, unsuccessfully by the way, before federal courts and the Supreme Court, that Congress giving rulemaking power to entities that are part of the executive branch are unconstitutional, because the power to make law and rules lies within Congress itself. But nonetheless, every day we see from federal agencies and cabinet departments as well, lots of this rulemaking, lots of these quasi-legislative actions taking place. On top of that, Congress often gives to these agencies the power not only to write the rules that will roll out these laws and then implement them at the department or agency level. These agencies and departments are also given frequently the power to enforce the rules they've made and implemented within their little part of the executive branch, so that these agencies have the means and the power to go out and see whether or not the rules or the laws that they've created are being complied with. And if an agency finds that there have been transgressions, that the rules as they've created them and implemented them have not been complied with, these agencies frequently have the power to bring administrative charges against the individual or the entity it accuses of violating the laws in question. And oftentimes, within the administrative part of the executive branch, hearings are held, cases are made, and sanctions, penalties are imposed upon these transgressors. Think about the SEC taking action against hedge funds or companies that manipulate stock in various ways. These are not matters that are brought ordinarily to the third branch of government, the judicial branch. Instead, these creatures of the executive branch are the judge, the jury, and the entity that imposes the sentence, the sanctions, to those found to have violated these rules. So this is a tremendous transformation. Maybe we call it an evolution. Maybe it's the inevitable result of the United States becoming a highly industrial, technological, large, interconnected country that we would, through the 20th century, become something perhaps that the framers of the Constitution, the men who wrote the Constitution in 1787, could not have foreseen. And as a consequence, it's a perfectly legitimate exercise of Congress using its powers to create these entities to do the types of things we've discussed, but it certainly creates a circumstance where parts of the executive branch, on the one hand, seem to be able to exercise legislative or quasi-legislative powers on one end, and then after their rules have been implemented as part of enforcement, we see these same agencies seem to have a lot of powers that look to be quasi-judicial in nature regarding the accusations, the hearings, and the impositions of sanctions against those transgressors. So the executive branch has grown into this huge, large collection of cabinet departments or, quote, cabinet level departments, coupled with, again, dozens, nearly 100 of these congressionally created federal agencies. And over time, we've seen these entities evolve into, for the most part, stable, reliable, well-running entities. I'm a cynic at times and could obviously point to examples where this is not the case. But running a government to work for the benefit of 330 million people is not an easy task. And we've seen that overwhelmingly 95, 96, 97% of all of the people who work in these departments, in these agencies, United States Postal Service being an example, for instance, of one of these large agencies, are non-political players, meaning that 95 to 98% of our federal workforce consists of career civil service protected federal workers. The Civil Service Act of 1881, enacted by Congress to eliminate the spoils system, an earlier practice that enabled a president coming into power and his cronies and his minions to clear out vast amounts of the federal workforce, put in loyal men and women to that particular president, reward political bosses with lots of patronage jobs, and then see maybe 4 years later, when that president is flushed out of office, a new president comes in, the entire or much of the federal workforce is again also cleaned out, and the idea of a smoothly functioning federal government from president to president, from decade to decade, would not be possible. So by the creation of civil service protected positions, again, throughout what we now refer to as the federal bureaucracy, we've created what hopefully is going to be a stable workforce that dedicating a career to working in communications or in tax policy or in the Postal Service, workers will become more experienced with job security. They'll be more honest and more diligent. And the only way they can be terminated typically is for cause, meaning that there has to be shown, proof has to be provided, that they somehow violated the terms of their employment. So the old mantra was presidents come and go, governments come and go, but the bulk of the federal workforce remains the same, from presidency to presidency to presidency. And that is today what we can consider or think about when we look at the millions of people, and there are millions, that work in these departments and agencies. Now, the president in the Constitution, in Article 2, Section 1, Part 1 of the Constitution, is given the power to appoint individuals to head, quote, executive departments, provided these individuals nominated by the president are confirmed by a vote of the United States Senate. We remember that between the two houses of Congress, the framers of the Constitution overwhelmingly gave to the Senate the power not only to render advice and consent, confirm individuals nominated to serve in the president's cabinet, individuals nominated to represent our country abroad as ambassadors and ministers, but also the Senate, and only the Senate by a 2/3 vote, would have to ratify any treaty that an American president committed our country to going forward. So atop these cabinet departments and atop these federal agencies are several strata, several layers of individuals who are political appointees. When a new president comes into office, because cabinet secretaries and undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, a certain number of layers at the top of the chain of command serve at the pleasure of the president, it is the incoming president's task to nominate individuals to sit atop these agencies and these departments with the idea that they will then filter through the ranks of their agencies and departments the particular policies that the president in office wants to maintain in some cases or to change. So with the departure of President Trump and the coming into office of Joe Biden, a Democratic president, we've seen again this great turnover in every cabinet department. And as these agency appointments, which are sometimes staggered in time, become open, we will see President Biden have an opportunity to make a number of nominations to them as well. And of course, in the last couple of weeks, as it relates to the judicial branch, the third branch of government, where federal judges are entitled to serve for life, provided after being nominated by the president, they've been confirmed by the Senate. And of course, we very notably saw 3 Supreme Court vacancies filled in just 4 years' time during the Trump administration, and saw the whole interplay between the executive branch and the Senate regarding judicial confirmations. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen the release of names that President Biden will shortly nominate to fill the always existing vacancies in the federal district courts, the trial courts that exist all around the country, and in the 12th Circuit Courts of Appeal, the intermediate appellate courts, where decisions typically coming from the result of a trial at the federal district court is appealed at one of the 12 circuit courts of appeals. And then, of course, the Supreme Court, which has the discretionary jurisdiction to basically pick which cases it wants to take on appeal. We've seen a number of names released from President Biden. We've seen a lot of judges who were appointed by previous Democratic presidents who held out, I guess if that's the right word, until another Democrat was in office, beginning to signal that they are now going to take senior status or by some other means retire, creating more vacancies for President Biden to fill. So we have watched, really since before President Biden was inaugurated on January the 20th, the rolling out of nominees, and after the hullabaloo, that's a technical term, surrounding the attack on the Capitol on January the 6th, after the very quick impeachment trial that took place after President Trump left office, still a lot of questions regarding, whether or not to do so is constitutional. There was a delay in the Senate actually beginning to consider many of President Biden's nominees. Now, we remember 4 years ago, after Donald Trump was elected, promising to be a disruptor, someone coming into office sort of with a wrecking ball to tear down a lot of the swampy, components of the federal government, that he would begin to announce his nominees for cabinet positions. And many of them were notable because they didn't have previous experience, in some cases, ever working within federal government or state government, for that matter. And in an America that demographically, of course, every year becomes more and more and more diverse. Every day, the United States becomes a little less white as a country and a little more Latino, Asian, African Americans. President Trump nominated a pretty consistently white and a very heavily male set of nominees, like many presidents who preceded him had done. So we saw, for instance, the CEO of Exxon, Rex Tillerson, resigning his position, leaving Houston and coming to Washington after he was confirmed to serve as Secretary of State. That relationship between Rex Tillerson and the president soured, I think that's the term that we might fairly use, about 2 years into the presidency, and Tillerson was fired, and Mike Pompeo would serve out President Trump's term as America's Secretary of State. Steve Mnuchin, who previously had been a Democrat, he was an investment banker who had worked at Goldman Sachs. He'd gone on to become a successful film producer. He was a significant fundraiser for candidate Trump in 2016. Never serving in government, Steve Mnuchin was nominated, confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury, and Mnuchin, of course, would serve out the entire 4 years of the president's term in that position. Remember the Mad Dog, James Mad Dog Mattis, who President Trump promised to make the Secretary of Defense if he were elected, was nominated by the president. He was confirmed after receiving a waiver from Congress that would allow someone who had not yet been retired from military service for 7 years to hold the position of Secretary of Defense. The position was traditionally occupied by a civilian appointee of the president as representing the power of the American military, ultimately controlled by a non-military civilian. So Mad Dog Mattis, confirmed by the Senate, and somewhere along the line, about 2 years in, he fell out of favor with the president. Mark Esper would fill out most of the president's term as Secretary of Defense. However, shortly after the election, the president would fire Esper, and Christopher Miller, a lower level member of the Defense Department, would serve out the president's term as the acting Secretary of Defense. So people like Wilbur Ross, a hedge fund manager, became our Secretary of Commerce. Ben Carson, formerly a neurosurgeon, a contender for the Republican nomination in 2016, was confirmed as Secretary of HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He would serve out 4 years in that position. Elaine Chao, who had previously served in both Bush administrations, a female of Asian ancestry, also Senate Majority Leader at the time, Mitch McConnell's wife, would be confirmed as the Secretary of Transportation and serve almost till to the end of the president's term. Betsy DeVos, another example of an individual who was a political activist and very much someone in favor of the creation of more charter schools, more freedom, as she phrased it, and fewer government schools, as she would often refer to them, was confirmed to serve as Secretary of Education. And she served, again, in that capacity for 4 years. And during those 4 years, again, we saw some significant deviations from the practices that President Obama had caused to occur within the executive branch during his 8 years as president. And in some cases, particularly in matters of foreign policy, we would see President Trump deviate from the paths that President Obama, George W. Bush, and even Bill Clinton before him had taken. Again, in many cases, going out in different areas. So today we're going to look again at these cabinet nominees. And we're going to first recognize that the nature of a president's cabinet has been expanded significantly throughout our country's history. As he did in so many things regarding the office and the practices of the President of the United States, George Washington would appoint and would create the first cabinet level departments, and then with the confirmation of the Senate, nominate the first individuals to occupy them. As Secretary of State, probably aside from the president, historically the most prominent, and as we've become since the end of World War II, a country with lots of interests in lots of matters around the world, one of the most visible and powerful cabinet positions, probably the most powerful, second to the president, Washington nominated Thomas Jefferson, a fellow Virginian, who would serve as our country's first Secretary of State. In order and because the United States had to manage the economy of the country at the federal level, powers that Congress were given often required congressional action, which often required federal expenditures. So in creating the Department of the Treasury and nominating the now very, very famous Alexander Hamilton to serve as our first Secretary of the Treasury, Washington again created this very powerful cabinet position. Because we were a young country, a small country compared, of course, to the size we would reach, and because there were still the great European powers. We might have caused the British in 1783 to recognize our sovereignty, but that was no guarantee that somewhere down the line the British wouldn't try to come back and reclaim their lost American colonies. The French were sniffing around, the Spanish were very prominent in Central and in South America. So in order to be prepared in the event, Congress had to fund a large army and a navy. And if the president, in a time of conflict, had to occupy his role as commander-in-chief of our military, Washington created the Department of War and nominated an individual, Henry Knox, to serve as our country's first Secretary of War. In 1947, in a number of pieces of legislation that would position the United States to be a more internationally involved country, one of the bills that came out of Congress would change the name of the more aggressive, hostile War Department to the Defense Department. And since 1947, the Defense Department, of course, has grown in size, has built the greatest, most powerful military the world now knows. China, of course, seeking to nip at our heels. And again, the Department of Defense is now this bastion of protecting not only our country, but our vital interests all around the world. And finally, in addition to creating a Secretary of State, Foreign Matters, Foreign Policy, the President is the chief foreign policy official as created in the Constitution, a Secretary of Treasury, a Department of Treasury, and a Department of War, Washington realized that the Constitution gave Congress the power to make laws that would include criminal charges, criminal statutes, codes of criminal statutes. And there needed to be an entity that would be the chief federal law enforcement officer when Congress made those laws. And Washington created the position of Attorney General in his very first cabinet and nominated Edmund Randolph to serve as our country's first AG, Attorney General. Now, after the Civil War, given the fact that the wartime and post-war Congress had passed a slew of laws dealing with Reconstruction and with protecting the rights of former slaves in the South, in order to better enable the Attorney General to comprehensively enforce these laws, in 1870, Congress created the Justice Department, the cabinet department today that, of course, is run by the Attorney General, even though the position of Attorney General had been created about 80 years before. So these cabinet departments were sufficient, as our country was a small country, but one that was getting larger. So after the great expansion of the United States in terms of either American states or territories that we owned, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled eventually the size of what the United States was geographically in 1803. At the conclusion of the Mexican War, ended by treaty in 1848, Mexico gave to the United States land in our Southwest that would eventually become the states of California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, a little bit of Wyoming, as well as Arizona and Nevada. Texas had been admitted as an American state in 1845, and around that time, we resolved a dispute with the British regarding where the so-called Oregon Territory ended, American territory in the northwestern United States, and where British provinces in what is today Vancouver would begin. So by around 1850, the United States would already own, as either states or territories that might one day become states, all of the land that would eventually become the lower continental 48 United States. The entirety of the United States until Alaska and Hawaii were admitted as American states in 1959. So with the realization that there were lands that our country owned that hadn't been sufficiently explored, nonetheless settled by land grant or other means, since it meant that by 1850 there were dozens and dozens of Native American tribes, Indian tribes as they were known, occupying vast areas of what were, in America's eyes, American territory. In 1849, Congress created the Department of the Interior, whose task was to survey, inventory, and monitor federal lands. And given the fact that the Constitution gives Congress the power to make treaties and agreements with the various Indian nations that existed at the time, the Department of the Interior and the Secretary of the Interior was the person to whom the task was delegated to go out and initiate these interactions with these native peoples. Now, the American Civil War began in 1861. It would be a 4-year bloodbath where perhaps 800,000 Americans lost their lives, most to illness and disease and nourishment issues. And because both sides had the task of feeding their troops, feeding their civilian population. In 1862, at the beginning of the American Civil War, Congress created the Department of Agriculture. And through the appointment of a Secretary of Agriculture, the more systematic procurement of whatever food that might be necessary to then feed the Union Army and those states that were still part of the Union was created. At the time, the United States was still more agricultural in its economy than any other type. So logically, creating a department to deal with the management of the greatest component of our economy was a sound one. In 1870, again, the Congress created the Justice Department to give the Attorney General a more systematic way to enforce federal laws coming out of Congress. And again, given all of the death and disease and illnesses that had run through both the Confederate and Union armies, and that had afflicted the civilian populations, particularly in the South as well, in 1870, Congress created the position of Surgeon General of the United States, an individual who would sit atop an entity, again, trying to deal with things like the control of communicable diseases and maybe perhaps informing Americans of better and safer ways to live. It would be about 94 years later, in 1964, when cigarette packages began containing that Surgeon General's warning. The Surgeon General has determined that cigarette smoking may be dangerous to your health. One of the later manifestations of the duties imposed on that position. Then, of course, through the remainder of the 19th century, the war ended in 1865, all the way into 1900 and beyond, the United States would undergo that great transformation that we've talked a lot about in the past, becoming a country that was suddenly an industrial power, a producer of energy, a great exporter of things we made and energy we produced. We would see the great growth of American cities, the places where factories and steel mills and rail yards were built, and the great urbanizing of America begin. By 1900, half of Americans lived in cities, half lived in rural areas or in farms. Just 40 years before 1900, in 1860, only 10% of Americans lived in cities. And of course, by 1900, the United States, who even before the Civil War had come to be regarded by foreign observers as a great melting pot of a country. There were British ancestors, Spanish ancestors, lots and lots of Scandinavians who came to the United States in the early part of the 19th century. America was so diverse, it even had a large growing population of Irish Catholics to complement and supplement its Protestant population. And by the 1850s, we were seeing a significant amount of Jewish immigration coming generally from the areas that are today Germany and Austria, making their way to the United States. By the end of the Civil War, as the United States began again to become more industrialized and urbanized, we would see the need for physical labor reach such height that the greatest wave of immigration in our history would soon begin. If you thought we were diverse before this and a melting pot before this, we would be a melting pot on steroids after the great rush of immigrants beginning around 1880 began to pour into our country. Russians, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Romanians, Turks, Greeks, Italians, Sicilians, making their way into the United States, and again, helping to explode our population and helping to create for a period of time a country having to deal with the effects of industrialization and urbanization and massive immigration very rapidly, something that had not been anticipated to occur. So by the turn of the last century, by 1900, by 1901, Theodore Roosevelt becomes the President of the United States, and intermittently for the 20th century, we would see periods where great amounts of reform, the progressive movement, would begin to, among other things, begin to grow the size of the federal government and expand, again, areas in which the federal government would exert its power and jurisdiction. So, in 1903, Congress created the Commerce Department, charged with, among other things, regulating interstate commerce, which was becoming more and more the norm by the early part of the last century, commerce that extended not only coast to coast, but international in scope. The Commerce Department would eventually be tasked with recommending to Congress laws dealing with monopolies and fair trade and other new areas of commerce that probably could not have been foreseen just 20 years before. In 1903, the department that was created was actually called the Department of Commerce and Labor. By 1903, Congress sort of beginning to dip its toe into the relationship between employer and employee, and beginning to impress upon lawmakers and eventually federal courts the idea that states or even Congress might have the ability to enact things like laws restricting child labor, laws creating a maximum work week. The 54-hour work week was a big goal of reformers back in 1903, and things like workplace safety and perhaps the creation of workers' compensation insurance for people hurt on the job. So by 1913, and the coming to office of Woodrow Wilson, Congress would slice away from the Department of Commerce and Labor the labor part of that job, and in 1913 create a separate Department of Labor. In 1913, many reformers believing that very soon Congress might create legislation giving workers the right through unions to better bargain collectively with their employers for the terms of their employment. In 1914, Congress created the Federal Reserve Administration, and the Federal Reserve System would soon be created as, again, not a national bank per se, but a national federal entity dealing with a banking system that at the time was almost completely decentralized, state by state by state by state. Now, after World War II, and after the great wealth that the United States would begin to recognize following the end of the Second World War, President Truman and President Eisenhower, who was by today's standards, a Democrat, a very moderate Republican, were looking for ways to create better, healthier lives for Americans, create better opportunities for Americans to be educated. So in 1953, Congress created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to again have a federal presence in promoting the health, the education, and the welfare of American citizens. In 1980, that department, Health, Education, and Welfare, would be rebranded the Department of Health and Human Services. 1 year after, in 1979, Congress had taken the education component from Health, Education, and Welfare and used it to create a separate standalone Department of Education, a federal department, in 1979. Lyndon Johnson's presidency, and then the presidency of Richard Nixon, another guy who in many respects, by today's standards, was very moderate. Lord knows what, he'd be called by some of the more conservative voices within our body politic today. During the Johnson presidency, Congress would create HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, trying to accelerate things like urban renewal, trying to help Americans who couldn't afford to do so to obtain a decent housing, and again, a very big federal footprint in housing throughout our country. And then in 1967, Congress would create a federal Department of Transportation. Further, again, federalizing, certainly the completion of things like the national interstate system that had been started under President Eisenhower, but also expanding the federal role in helping to design and fund large transportation projects. During the Nixon presidency, in 1970, Richard Nixon signed a bill creating the Environmental Protection Agency, which is today a cabinet-level department that has been given by Congress the authority to regulate the purity of the air we breathe and the water we drink, and to prohibit, in some cases, excessive quantities of lead and methane and nitrogen and arsenic and other dangerous substances from our water, from our food supply, and from our air. In 1970, recognizing that the federal government had sure expanded a lot in size, particularly after the end of the Second World War, and there were suddenly lots and lots of federal commitments regarding ongoing budgeting of this larger federal government, this larger executive branch. Congress created the Office of Management and Budget to particularly work between the Congress and the President to create the budgets to cover the expenses that the federal government would have to incur in a calendar year. In 1979, as we mentioned earlier, the Department of Education would come into being. And then 10 years later, in 1989, at a time when, as a percentage of our population, we had a very high population of military veterans, particularly those who had served during times of war, World War II, the Korean conflict, the Vietnamese conflict. In 1989, Congress created a cabinet department, the Department of Veterans Affairs, in order to better run and manage not just the healthcare component that America owed to those who had defended our country by serving in the military, but deal with things like VA loans and other scattered components of how the United States thanked veterans for their service. 9/11, the attacks almost 20 years ago. This September 11th will be, unbelievably, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. We're going to do a lecture about that and about the war on terrorism later this year. I know for my generation, it is the one time in my life that I could answer, I remember where I was when I'd heard that the first of the two towers at the World Trade Center had been struck. The fact that these attacks occurred and the fact that they were not earlier detected as plots that were being hatched on our soil, and the fact that the FBI and the Defense Department and the CIA were not sharing information, the fact that these hijackers were able to carry knives and box cutters and other weapons onto the airplanes that they would then hijack, Congress began a process of restructuring a lot of how we gather intelligence, and more urgently, how we were going to very quickly defend our homeland. So in 2002, based on recommendations from the 9/11 Commission, I've got a copy of the report of the 9/11 Commission, which really, if you've forgotten, is a great story. It's written as a narrative of the events leading up to 9/11. Read the introduction, and it will very quickly reacquaint you with what occurred. Congress created the Department of Homeland Security, whose job would be to prevent and protect airports, waterways, areas along our border where people with nefarious intents to do harm to our country might be able to do so. And then in 2005, to re-engineer how intelligence was collected, analyzed, and very quickly acted upon, Congress created a Director of National Intelligence who organizationally sits atop the FBI in its foreign interdiction activities, the CIA, which was created by Congress in 1947 in the same bill that rebranded the War Department, the Defense Department, and in the same bill that Congress made, that President Truman signed into law, that severed the Air Force out of the control of the United States Army and created a fourth separate branch of our military, the United States Air Force. The Central Intelligence Agency was also created in that legislation, and now the Director of National Intelligence sits atop all of military intelligence as well. That is not an oxymoron, by the way, like political science. All of the intelligence that's gathered by these various entities are now more efficiently analyzed by this and choreographed and supervised by this Director of National Intelligence. So we've seen, I guess sort of logically, the size of the federal cabinet grow, the number of cabinet departments grow, as the United States began now 240 years ago. You know, this journey from a small country of 13 states along the Atlantic Ocean to now, of course, this large, highly populated, completely integrated, militarily, commerce, throughout the rest of the world, sort of in an evolutionary fashion. We would see Congress, in their wisdom, try through the creation of these cabinet departments to create in areas where a federal presence was needed, these departments to be delegated a lot of the powers to deal in their own fields. So President Biden now has a pretty filled out and confirmed cabinet. We're just going to run through some of the notable members and recognize that Joe Biden's election and his successful presidential campaign dealt with promises to the American people to create in the judiciary, in his own executive office of the president, his internal advisors, and in America's cabinet, individuals that were diverse and looked like the America that existed in 2020. So we'll point out the notable firsts that many of these members of the cabinet represent, usually on the basis of gender, maybe on the basis of race or of religion as well. So the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, not Anthony, Antony, Antony, was Joe Biden's national security advisor when he was vice president for 8 years to President Obama, and he was an assistant Secretary of State during the period 2015 to 2017. 4 years later, he's back out there again running a lot of America's foreign policy. For the second time in 2 consecutive presidencies, like President Trump had done, President Biden nominated a recently retired 4-star general, Lloyd Austin, one of whose last commands was to run from Tampa Central Command, the unified part of our military responsible for managing our affairs and our wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. Lloyd Austin, upon his nomination, was the first African American nominated to serve as our Secretary of Defense. Like Mattis, because 7 years had not elapsed between Austin's retirement and him becoming, I guess, a 7-year-long civilian. We like civilians at the top of the Defense Department. Congress passed a waiver that enabled Austin to be confirmed as Defense Secretary short of that 7-year retirement point. For Secretary of the Treasury, we have seen Janet Yellen confirmed, the first female to serve as our Treasury Secretary. Yellen comes with a lot of experience. She was formerly the chairman of the Federal Reserve and a professor emeritus in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. And she was someone, I suspect, who was able to hit the ground running. For Secretary of Transportation, Biden nominated and the Senate confirmed Pete Buttigieg, 38 years old, former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, former Democratic presidential contender. Pete Buttigieg is the first person from the LBGT community to serve openly from that community, to serve as the head of a cabinet branch in the United States. For the position of Secretary of Health and Human Services, formerly Health, Education, and Welfare, President Biden nominated Xavier Becerra, a former member of the House, former Attorney General of the state of California. Becerra was confirmed and is now the Secretary of HHS. The Department of the Interior, that, again, department now charged with managing the millions of acres, particularly in the West, that is run and owned by the United States government. The cabinet department that still oversees the affairs of Native American tribes who have now tribal lands and businesses and casinos and all the like. President Biden nominated, and the Senate confirmed Deb Haaland, who previously had served in the House from New Mexico, and Deb Haaland becomes the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary, again, in this very important Department of Interior. For Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, the Senate confirmed Alejandro Mayorkas, foreign-born, naturalized American citizen, born in Cuba. He's Jewish. He becomes the first Latino to serve as as director of the Department of Homeland Security, the secretary, which of course is responsible for, among other things, monitoring and protecting our country's southern border. For the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Senate confirmed President Obama's former chief of staff, Dennis McDonough, who is notable in one respect for himself not being a veteran. Some noise made about that. He nonetheless was confirmed by the Senate. For the Secretary, as the Director of National Intelligence, the Senate confirmed Avril Haines, who during the Obama administration served as Deputy Director of the CIA. Avril Haines becomes the first woman to serve as the Director of National Intelligence. To run the Department of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, this huge budget-creating machine, you may recall that Biden initially nominated a woman by the name of Neera Tanden, whose nomination was withdrawn, she declined the nomination after a number of senators, including Joe Manchin from West Virginia, announced he would not vote to confirm her because she'd sent some nasty tweets out criticizing sitting members of Congress prior to occupying this position. In particular, she referred to Mitch McConnell as Moscow Mitch. Pretty tame by other Twitter account standards, but she withdrew her nomination, and the Senate confirmed Shalonda Young, an African-American female, the first to serve as the Director of the Department of the Office of Management and Budget. As Secretary of Labor, President Biden nominated and the Senate confirmed Marty Walsh, the mayor of Boston, who is now Secretary of Labor, a former union leader, Boston's mayor since 2014. Marty Walsh, as the Secretary of Labor, I suspect, is going to have a much different perspective on the relationship between workers and their employers, and perhaps on the ease of workers attempting to unionize than did his predecessor, Eugene Scalia, a son of the late Antonin Scalia, who was perceived as being a pro-management Secretary of Labor. So watch on the labor front. I suspect changes are afoot. To serve as Secretary of Commerce, the Senate confirmed Gina Raimondo, again, who up until this point was the governor of the state of Rhode Island. And again, at the state level, had been fairly notable in helping to balance what had been a pretty unstable Rhode Island economy. As Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, President Biden nominated Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland was a judge sitting on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, considered to be, aside from the Supreme Court, the most important federal court in the country. You may recall that Judge Garland in early 2016 was nominated by President Obama to fill the seat, the vacancy created by the death of Antonin Scalia. But because Mitch McConnell and Republicans controlled the majority in the Senate, and because McConnell asserted that it was an election year and the American people should elect the president who fills this seat, McConnell would not entertain Judge Garland's nomination. And after President Trump won, he nominated instead Neil Gorsuch, who was the first of President Trump's 3 nominees to the Supreme Court. And then, of course, we remember last year that after Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, less than 2 months before an election, after President Trump nominated Judge Amy Coney Barrett, Mitch McConnell held hearings. Judge Barrett was confirmed by the Senate 9 days before the presidential election, November the 3rd. Biden waited until the 2 Senate races in Georgia, which again, so much of what is happening now is based on the fact that Democrats have 50 seats in the Senate and Vice President Harris is a tie-breaking vote. When both of these Georgia seats went to Democrats, meaning that in practical terms, Democrats would control the Senate, only then was Merrick Garland nominated to serve as Attorney General, because now that his seat is open, President Biden knows that he will be able to nominate someone to fill that seat that in all probability is going to be confirmed, if by no other margin, by a 51-50 margin in the Senate, with Kamala Harris breaking the tie vote. For Surgeon General of the United States, Vivek Murthy was confirmed by the Senate. He served as Surgeon General during most of President Obama's time in office, was rejected by the Senate after President Trump came into office, because Surgeon General Murphy believes that firearms in homes might have some consequences on the health of children in American families. That may or may not be true, but of course that type of thinking is anathema to Second Amendment gun rights advocates. He is now back on the job, as is Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, a former Iowa governor who served as Secretary of the Department of Agriculture for all 8 years during the Obama administration. he's now back for another run. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge, a former member of the House from Ohio, an African-American woman who was formerly the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, has replaced, taken the place of Ben Carson, dealing with this federal department, dealing with housing and increasingly ways to better house less affluent Americans. Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, formerly the Commissioner of Education in the state of Connecticut. He is now the Secretary of the Department of Education, a Latino appointment, of course, to this position. As Commissioner of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Senate confirmed the North Carolina Environmental Chief Michael Regan, an African American, who again